Hello, everyone. This is number 7 in my ongoing series on YouTube, dealing with what I'm calling for short, just Jesus Archaeology. The idea is to look at texts that we have, primarily the New Testament Gospels, and then compare them to archaeological evidence on the ground. That can be sites, artifacts, even the landscape, that's part of archaeology, basically the material evidence. And does it correlate or does it shed any light? Does it help us to further understand the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth? So in today's episode or video, I'm going to explore a site or a town on the shores of the Sea of Galilee on the northwest called Migdal or Magdala. If Magdala sounds familiar to any of you, it's probably because of a person in the New Testament, a very mysterious person that we'd like to know a lot more about, the famous Mary Magdalene, the Magdalena. One possible understanding of her name is that she is Mary from Magdala or Migdal, and that's really the majority opinion of most scholars, but we'll talk about some alternative ideas. So I'm going to start my slides right away. Got some really great things to share with you. Okay, take a look at this map. I call this Jesus country. For the past few years, I've done a tour each year on the Holy Land, and I call that tour Tracking Jesus. So this is the arena in which one can begin to track Jesus, that is the Galilee. The way this is colored, this is the territory of Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. And this is Magdala, or Magdala as it's sometimes pronounced, right on the shores of the Northwest. I've already talked about Capernaum. You can see right up there, further to the northwest. Tiberias, we're going to talk about later. We've done Sepphoris, and we've talked about that. I've alluded to Cana. This is the authentic site of Cana that's been excavated, and we'll cover that later. I've done Nazareth as well as Raphia, which is actually the whole area right here, of which Nazareth is just a little village that's part of the urban area. So we're going to cover a little bit of that again today because we're going to compare Magdala to Nazareth and to other towns in the Galilee. Magdala is really spectacular in terms of what we can read about it in some of our historical sources. Also, the excavations that have been going on since the turn of this millennium in the year 2000s. Some major things have been discovered. I've been carefully following the excavations at Magdala. I've been there dozens of times, talked to some of the major excavators, even sent students to dig there. So I've kept up with it, and particularly the last 20 years, where some really significant finds have been found. So there you know where it is. There's the Sea of Galilee, the River Jordan flowing out of it down south through the land of Israel. Now, Migdal is the Hebrew name for the town, and Migdal means tower. So literally, Migdal is Tower Town. We're not sure how it got that name, but it's a major harbor or port, and it's very likely that there was a huge watchtower right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and maybe that's how it got that name. We call it today Magdala or Migdala. Sometimes people will even put the I sound with Migdala to try to preserve some of the Hebrew. But Magdala is the normal way people talk about it today in English. And in Greek, it's also called Tarakia. When Josephus talks about Magdala or Migdal, he calls it Tarakia. And tarik is a salty fish dish. It's a certain kind of a fish to make a kind of a dip that the Romans were quite fond of. And this salted pickled fish was used to make a sauce that was called garum, G-A-R-U-M, that was a delicacy in the Roman world. And so Magdala was known for the production of this garum, which was known all over the world. Josephus, who's our contemporary Jewish historian of the first century, he says that there were 204 towns and villages in the Galilee. The largest was Jaffa, the largest town. Remember, we talked about that when we covered Nazareth. If you've listened to the previous episodes, if not, you can go back. And the largest city was Sepphoris. That's in his work called The Life of Josephus. If you've never read The Life of Josephus, it's available in the complete works of Josephus. I think you would really enjoy reading it. It covers so many things, such as this. But in his Jewish War, here's the source down here, he tells us quite a bit more about it. It was a Roman administrative center until Tiberias was built. So the capital of Tiberias came along later. Let me go back right there. And Tiberias was built by Herod Antipas, who was in Sepphoris. That was his urban capital. And he built this beautiful seaside resort Roman city in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. So basically, Magdala was second to Tiberias. It had a population, according to Josephus, about 40,000 residents. At times it would swell larger. He mentions a hippodrome and a theater. Those have not been excavated, and I'll explain that to you when we look at some maps. The city flourishes from the 1st century BCE down to the first Jewish revolt, which was 66 to 73 under Nero and Vespasian. It was a strategic harbor town, so you have military battles constantly. When the Maccabees were fighting against Antiochus Epiphanes and his forces, there's a major battle at Taricheae or Magdala. It was a strategic harbor town, and therefore you get military battles. The Maccabees, that would be about 165 BCE, had a major battle there with the forces of the Greek Antiochus Epiphanes. Some of you know a lot about that. That's where we get our celebration of Hanukkah in Jewish tradition. Herod the Great, when he was pacifying the Galilee and clearing it of thieves and robbers and brigands under the leadership of his father, whom the Romans had put in charge, he also had major battles and clashes at Taricheae or Magdala. And during the first revolt, Josephus gives us a great deal of detail about major battles involving hundreds of ships, thousands of troops against the inhabitants of Magdala, who were slaughtered or exiled as slaves to Nero. He also mentions that the waters on the shore turned red because of all the blood. So we've got quite a bit of history, particularly in Josephus, about this town. This is a photograph that was taken around the year 1890. It's been colored, you can see. And this would be the site of ancient Migdal. These are modern buildings. These are not ancient. But under this, right here, under this area, is where there have been excavations trying to locate the site of ancient Magdala. And it is literally sprung up from the ground, as you're going to see. It's quite amazing. Now, what have the excavations revealed so far? And only a small percentage of the huge area has been excavated. As I told you, the theater and the hippodrome haven't even been found. Large marketplace with 28 shops, 300 fishing weights. You'd expect that on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. 40 pools. Now, what are these pools for? Obviously, not all mikvahs or ritual pools for people to bathe in. These pools are for collecting the fish and then preparing them to make this very exotic and tasty garum, as it was called. 4,000 ancient coins that allows archaeologists to date the different periods of habitation, and the majority of them were minted in Jerusalem. There's evidence of large-scale commercial interactions between Magdala and many other ancient cities, not just the Galilee, but also Jerusalem, ports along the Mediterranean Sea, including Caesarea Maritima that Herod the Great built to honor Augustus the Emperor, this magnificent city on the coast, which I will also be exploring with you archaeologically in this series. So far has been found residential as well as industrial areas, but most of the areas that have been uncovered have to do with this fish industry right on the shore. But look at this, 2 first-century synagogues, which is just extraordinary. The first one was found in 205, 206. I got to go there when it was being excavated and see it as it was being uncovered. It was quite exciting. One of my students was there that year, wrote a paper on it. But just recently, a second one has been found. So in a city of this size, we can only guess how many synagogues there were. Now, most likely only a small portion of the ancient site will be uncovered. That's because the Franciscans own the land that has been excavated, but other areas on the harbor, north and south, are owned by various entities, and it's not clear that they will be given over to excavations. This is the synagogue as it began to appear when I was first there. It's just absolutely extraordinary. It's fairly small. You can just judge by people sitting on these benches how large it would be. So this is one of the synagogues, and you can see the rooms. You have a kind of ante or back room where you could keep various kinds of things related to the synagogue. It had pillars. Here's one of the pillars. Here are 2 more. And then you've got the perimeter. But look at what is left of these plastered floors. Beautiful mosaics. It's just extraordinary as a building. And right in the center, remember this, the mystery stone. It was found right there. Nobody knows what it is. Why is it there? Is it part of the synagogue? And we're going to talk about that at the end. That's to keep you all the way to the end, because I'm going to tell you about this because it's a main attraction when people go to Migdal. They want to see this stone, and we'll take a look at it. But if you think about Mary Magdalene, I mean, who could not think? We read in the Gospels that Jesus is preaching in the synagogues of the area. So you have to ask, if this is Migdal, Magdala, and this is a first-century synagogue, did Jesus speak in this synagogue? And I think that's one of the things we try to imagine when we go there. The area around the seating area could be used for people standing and listening. Here's a close-up of the floor and what's left of it. Earthquakes and various damage have buckled it a little bit, but look at the beautiful designs. They're geometric, no animals or human or plant motifs, anything of that sort. It's very conservative in terms of a Jewish synagogue. And here's our mystery stone right there. This is a close-up of it. There's also plastered walls, as we're going to see. And there's the synagogue. They have that covered up. So here's some tourists looking at it. And then you have streets. And this is part of this industrial area. This is, of course, a modern building. It's a guest house and a hotel. It's quite beautiful. I'll show you pictures of it later. But you can begin to see what's been uncovered. And here's the ground level. See the ground level? So you only have to go down a half a meter or so to begin to get to the top of some of these ancient layers. And some of this has, of course, been restored. It's just like Capernaum. If you saw that video, they're using this stone, this black basalt stone that is native to the area for the building. So everything's made of stone. Here's an overview to give you a bit of perspective. Right here, you can see the road coming down from Tiberias, winding around the Sea of Galilee. And then you begin to see the excavations. Now, this is the synagogue. It's on the north when it was first discovered. So you can see that it's right, you pull off the road and right there you can go and see the synagogue. This is now paved over. Some of it's been excavated. All of this has been excavated. Some of this has been excavated. And you can see some of the probes here. This is the area we just saw off the street that goes down. So this, and notice this is the seashore. There haven't been excavations all the way down to the shore. And as you go south, you're going to see there's even more area where possibly more of the remains would be. Here's another view. Here we're looking across the Sea of Galilee. There's the synagogue area. There's the industrial area. This is new, and this is where that second synagogue has been found. And then 2 or 3 more areas, and there's even been more done today. This is the guest house. There's a beautiful church here that is just one of the most beautiful churches I've ever seen in my life. And the glassed-in altar at the front looks over the Sea of Galilee, and it's in the shape of a boat. You can walk down to the shore and walk along the shore, and it's quite inspiring. This is across the Sea of Galilee on the other side, which would be today the Golan Heights. Here's the guest house or the hotel. It's quite beautiful, and it's right next to the excavation areas. So this has become a huge tourist center. Everybody wants to go to Magdala. Now, why do people want to go to Magdala? We'll get to that. And here is our mystery stone. I'm standing here talking about it. Here's the group I was with. I think this was in March of 2023. And here you can see different angles of the stone. Let's start with this side of it. Clearly, you've got a menorah, which would represent something in the temple in Jerusalem, and a couple of jugs. And here on the top, you got some very interesting motifs. You see the fish here, 2 fish. I've heard people say these are loaves of bread, but if you look, you can clearly see the tail and the body and the head of the fish. So fish, that makes sense, 2 fish. Maybe these are loaves of bread. Maybe these are loaves of bread because it's repeated here. And then the palm trees that you can see on each side. Here are some other angles from the other side of this as you go around. These seem to represent the gates of the temple, and these are typical motifs of the florets and the various decorations that we find in Jewish art of the time. Now, why would this stone be in the middle of the synagogue? Some have thought maybe you would put a Torah scroll on it or one of the holy books to read. There are scholars who suggested things like, well, maybe there was a built-up podium or platform, and then this was up on top of it or whatever. I have no idea what it was, but it does seem to symbolize a connection with Jerusalem because you've got the menorah and you've got the gates of the temple and different motifs like that, but also the fish and the bread and the palm trees. This is a replica on display. The real thing is in Jerusalem at the Notre Dame Center. And I don't think the real thing is on display, but it's still being studied. But it's really an interesting thing, and people have all kinds of interpretations of what they see. Okay, now I want to go back to the synagogue where you can remind yourself where this was. There it is right there. That's exactly where it was found. Doesn't mean that's where it was anciently, but underground, that's where it was found. And I want to show you something else about the splendor of the building. You can see the mosaics were quite nice, but look at this. The walls were plastered, and this color scheme is what we find all over the Holy Land in first century palaces like Herod the Great at Masada and at the Herodium. This is a typical color scheme that you find. And here's some of the plaster has survived. So you have to imagine this if you go back. These walls going up with the plaster around them, a beautiful roof with columns holding it up and so forth, and then mosaics all around. It was really quite nice. This is amazingly well preserved, though, to just be able to see the rooms and the entrance right here. You would come into the synagogue. And notice here, here's the ground level, and it's just below the ground, just like Capernaum. Remember Capernaum again, if you've seen that video. Now, let's talk about Mary Magdalene and connect it to Magdala, possibly. You know, Mary Magdalene is so mysterious. Here's our earliest gospel, Mark chapter 15, verse 40. And that's our earliest mention of this important woman. There were also women looking on from afar. This is at the crucifixion of Jesus. And the women are watching the crucifixion. And then it lists them, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Jose, that's clearly Jesus' mother, and Salome. And we think that's very possibly Jesus' sister. So if so, this is a very close group. Mary Magdalene mentioned first, notice, and then Jesus' mother. Mark 15:47, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jose, saw where he was laid. So once he's buried, they follow to the tomb. And then Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, that's Jesus' mother, and Salome, same group, bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. So this is additional information that we have in John. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother, okay, we've got her here, and his mother's sister. So maybe Salome is his mother's sister. That's very possible. And Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene is mentioned last by John, but she's very important, as we're going to see a little bit later in the Gospel of John. She might even be called the first apostle, as we'll see. So these are the core texts. Where did she come from? Who is she? If her name means Mary from Magdala, then that would be your answer. The name Mary or Miriam is one of the two most common names for women in the time. So this would be distinguishing her. So Mary the mother and Mary, the one from Magdala. So she's called Mary Magdalene, and that's how we know her. But notice this. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 1, Jesus is going through the cities and villages, preaching in the synagogues and bringing good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who'd been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. And then he says this amazing note: Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. That means Herod's chief of staff. This is Herod Antipas and Sepphoris, and Susanna, and many others. And that many others in Greek is feminine, meaning many other women who provided for them out of their means. This implies that Mary, called Magdalene, is a woman of wealth and influence. Chuza is Herod's chief of staff in Sepphoris, and his wife Joanna is following Jesus. Susanna, we don't know her connection, but she's named here, and they are providing out of their purse, literally, okay? So she's called Maria the Magdalene, and she's called Miriam the Magdalene in different texts in Greek in the New Testament. So what does that mean? The main view that many, many scholars have, I certainly lean toward this view, is she's Mary from Magdala. Hey, Mary, like Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene. So Mary from Magdala, that seems the simplest. And notice here he's in the Galilee. So she's up in the Galilee following Jesus. That would fit in with her being from Migdal, even though when we're first introduced to her in the Gospel of Mark, she's down in Jerusalem. But she had followed from the Galilee, and that's very clear in the Synoptic Gospels. So she's Galilean. If she's Galilean, Migdal's right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. But there's another possibility. If you remember, Jesus would give his followers nicknames, okay? So Peter is called Simon Peter, or Cephas, the rock. Peter's Greek for rock, but Cephas is Aramaic. So his name is Simon, or Shimon Kepha, the rock, okay? So Rocky, we'd say today, right? And then what about James and John? They're called the sons of thunder. Later, Thomas gets called the doubter, but the name means the twin. So maybe he's just called the twin. So Jesus gives these nicknames to his followers to kind of designate them. Some have suggested that Mary, being called Migdal, Mary Migdal, is being called the tower, that she's a tower of strength, a tower of faith. Some have even said maybe she was of tall stature. This is speculation. I tend to go with the Migdal, but we're not sure. Now, there is a text in Micah 4, verse 8, that leads into a messianic text, and it talks about the Migdal of the flock, the tower of the flock. And it could be, as some have suggested, that when Jesus names Mary, he says, Mary, you're the tower of the flock. In later Christian literature, not in the New Testament, Mary gets a really prominent place in some of the Gnostic texts. And we even have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in which the disciples become jealous of Mary Magdalene after the death of Jesus, because Jesus would share with her some of the secrets of the gospel that he did not share with the males. Now, that's in those later texts. We don't know how historical that is. But people that lean toward this tower interpretation and then go on reading in Micah 5, it's about the Davidic Messiah. And this has been suggested that Jesus might have said, Mary, you are the tower of the flock. You're going to stand tall when I leave, when I die, when I go through my suffering. You will be the tower of strength and faith, or something along those lines. Now, here's a Talmudic possibility. There is a Mary Magdala, which actually means to grow. Here it is in Hebrew, Miriam, Migdala. So what would it mean to grow? To grow what? One is to take care of the baby, to the baby tender, to make the baby grow. In other words, the guide of the baby. People have then speculated Jesus maybe was with Mary Magdalene, even have a child with Mary Magdalene. There is a Jesus, son of Joseph, in the Talpiot tomb. Some people have connected that to Mary Magdalene because there is a Mary Amne in the Talpiot tomb. Go back and listen to number 1 of the series. I talk about that. And that ossuary is beautifully decorated and written in Greek as if it might be from a woman who had some real culture and wealth, reflecting a more sophisticated background. But there's also a tradition that she's a hairdresser. That is, you make hair grow, so tending to hair. So you see, we got 3 basic possibilities. Is she named for the town? Is she called the Tower of Faith? Or this one, maybe you've never heard. Was she the baby tender, or was she a hairdresser? So either way, we find her at the cross, and here's a beautiful painting that's at the Myers Park Methodist Church here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live. And I'm very moved by this painting. And they've taken Jesus down from the cross, and she's sitting there as the men who are in charge, standing here, are ready to wrap him up and take him to the temporary grave, according to the Gospel of John, where he will later be reburied by Joseph of Arimathea. And I've also done lectures on that. Now, I want you to notice this. If you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the story is that these women that are mentioned in Mark, Mary Magdalene, Jesus' mother, and a Salome, came early to the tomb on Sunday morning. But notice here, in John, who knows a different tradition, it's similar, but notice it's different. On the first day of the week, Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early. She's alone, and it's still dark. So it's not at sunrise, it's even before dark. Maybe it was 4 or 5 in the morning. Maybe it was even earlier, but it's very early. It says early, still dark. And she saw that the stone had been taken away. Now, I doubt that the stone had been moved in the darkness in the wee hours of the morning. It was probably taken away the night before, because the previous chapter told about Joseph of Arimathea and his burial party putting Jesus temporarily into a tomb that happened to be near the place of crucifixion. Only John notes that. Not a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. He wouldn't happen to have his family tomb near a place of crucifixion, which I think is the Mount of Olives, and I'll cover that later. I don't think it's the traditional site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the alternative site that many Protestants favor, called Gordon's Calvary, or the Garden Tomb. I think it's on the Mount of Olives, and in that first lecture that I gave on the 10 tombs in this series, I talk about that, so you can go back and listen to that, and maybe we can even locate that tomb. But either way, it's temporary. So the burial party had come probably sundown right after the Sabbath. Now it's Sunday morning. Remember, the Sabbath's over at sundown. Now, why would they come Saturday night? because the body has been in the tomb for several days and it's beginning to decay. I've concluded that Jesus was crucified on a Thursday, not a Friday. And then there was the holy day of Passover, which was a Sabbath, and then the weekly Sabbath, so 2 Sabbaths back to back. So the burial party would have come as soon as possible. 2 whole days had passed to get the body because it's beginning to decay and to move it and rebury it on Joseph of Arimathea's property, most likely. That's where he would provide a tomb. He already owns land. He lives in that area. He's very wealthy. So anyway, she gets there and notice it's open. The body has been removed. So she ran and went to Simon Peter. Okay, that's Peter as we call him. And the other disciple whom Jesus loved. I personally am convinced that that is James, the brother of Jesus. They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him. So these are the pillars of the church later. Paul calls them James, Peter, and John. In this case, James and Peter. We don't know where they have laid him. Notice where the burial party has put him. Where's the permanent burial place? They thought they could get there before he was being moved. Peter then came out with the other disciple. They run to the tomb. So they're staying on the Mount of Olives. They're staying at Bethany. We're going to talk about that. Excavations and things we know about Bethany. They both ran, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping in to look, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he didn't go in. And then Simon came and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen clothes and the napkin which had been on his head. So it's a two-piece burial shroud. I'll do a program later on the only first-century burial shroud ever found. We call it the Tomb of the Shroud. It's in that first lecture again. So that first lecture covers the tombs of a lot of things that I'm saying today, and it has a body piece and a head piece. Anyway, they leave those clothes behind because they're going to wrap him in a permanent shroud and place him in another tomb. The other disciple who reached the tomb first finally went in, and he saw and believed. Now, what did he believe? It doesn't say he believed in the resurrection. It says he believed that the body's gone. I'm talking about if you just read the first 10 verses, this is the initial report. This is so realistic. This is exactly what people would expect. The burial party comes Saturday night. They move the body. They permanently rebury it. They leave the grave clothes behind that would be full of blood and different body fluids that was quickly wrapped around him when they buried him. And then Mary Magdalene runs and tells James and Peter, as I understand the beloved disciple to be James, and they run and check, and they go, wow, yes, he is gone. For as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise from the dead. So they don't think he's risen from the dead at this point. And then the disciples went back to their homes. Now, that could mean back to the Galilee. And here's why. Here's Mary alone at the tomb, just beautiful painting. That's not what the tombs look like, but I love the sentiment. But in the lost Gospel of Peter, it was discovered in 1886, a little fragment of it in Upper Egypt by a French archaeologist, Lorient. It says it was the final day of unleavened bread, and many went out returning to their homes since the feast was over. So this is 7 days later. But the 12 disciples were weeping and sorrowful. Now, why would they be weeping and sorrowful if Jesus has been raised from the dead, appearing to them throughout the week, twice on Sunday, all through the week, and for 40 days after? They're weeping and sorrowful, each one sorrowful because of what had come to pass, and departed to his home. And I, Simon Peter, this is written by Peter, Gospel of Peter, according to the text. I don't know that Peter wrote it. I don't believe that, but it's recording this tradition. But I, Peter, and my brother Andrew, having taken our nets, went off to the sea. So they've gone back to the Galilee. Now notice this. If this is an original text, before Mark, before Matthew, before Luke, and before the later material of John that was added, this would be the original experience of the empty tomb, Jesus reburied, and the disciples go back home. It doesn't say exactly when they went back home, but you might know that the final day of unleavened bread is 7 days later. So they stay through the festival. The Passover festival, including the slaying of the lambs and the Seder and so forth, lasts for 8 days. And so I think this tradition fits in very well with the first 10 verses of John, and they really tell the same story. Now, on the day of Pentecost, which is 50 days after Passover, the weekend of Passover, the book of Acts in the New Testament tells us that they're back in Jerusalem. Now, Luke keeps them in Jerusalem the whole time. But I'm talking about this original tradition that we're trying to trace of Mary Magdalene as the first witness. And what it says is that all the 11 are there, and his mother and his brothers. And notice what we see in this painting. And I think this is very likely representing Mary Magdalene. You see the flames of fire and so forth. So we started with the excavations at Migdal or Magdala and what we can know about it and from Josephus and from history and so forth. And if Mary Magdalene is from the Galilee, which certainly seems to be the case in our text, she's with these other women and comes to the Galilee, and Mary and his sisters and his whole family are there for the Passover, then we can possibly connect her to the city of Migdal. And she seems to be a woman of influence and wealth, and she's very influential later in earliest church tradition. Basically, in the New Testament, the story drops. Some have said it drops because she is married to Jesus and has a child, and that's not something that the Orthodox Church wants to talk about. So it was edited out. I frankly don't know. I mean, all we can do is go with the sources that we have. And as far as the early New Testament sources, I've just covered them. But we can imagine Jesus, remember the map, coming from Cephas, coming from Nazareth, down that Beit Netofa Valley, ending up right at Migdal. When you come down that valley, it spills out at Migdal. And that's where he very likely could have met Mary Magdalene if she's from there. And he would indeed have preached in that synagogue. Now, I don't know how much light this sheds on our knowledge of Jesus, but the mystery woman, if she is from Migdal, we can put her in a large urban harbor city, a prosperous city, and we can imagine that she does, in fact, belong with these other women of influence. And Luke preserves this single little tradition for us that not only is Mary Magdalene from the Galilee, but she's associated with these women of means. And when we first encounter her, she and those women and others are supporting the Jesus movement. They're the underpinning of the movement. So she's certainly a woman of prominence and closeness to Jesus and to his family. But I will mention this book, The Jesus Discovery. And if you want to get this book, it goes so well with this whole series because it's on the archaeology of the Jesus movement. But there is a chapter here that I'll turn to, and it says Jesus and Mary Magdalene, chapter 5. And I give you my latest interpretation of all of these things about Mary Magdalene, that she's the apostle of the apostles and the different texts and everything that we know about her. And I am one scholar who has concluded that there's some pretty good evidence from this material that we have that Mary is a very close companion of Jesus, if not his wife. And I'm not going to argue that now. I do go over it in the book. And that's a view that I did not hold when I wrote the previous book, The Jesus Dynasty. I had kind of dismissed it, oh, that's more of that Dan Brown stuff and all the women that are flocking around the idea of Mary Magdalene, but there's no evidence for it. I now think there is evidence for it. And in that chapter on Mary Magdalene, I think I present some very strong arguments. Now, if she's in the Talpiot tomb as well, then you've got archaeological evidence, and there's also a child. His name is Judah, son of Jesus. But in terms of this presentation, I'll leave that for now, and let's just think about the city of Migdal or Magdala, and if it is the hometown of Mary Magdalene, what the implications might be. I think it's pretty amazing. I'm telling you, being in that synagogue, whether you put Mary Magdalene there or not, is an extraordinary experience because it's a first century synagogue. You know, when I first started my career several decades ago, it was pretty well textbook knowledge that there were no first century synagogues in existence, and that possibly the idea of a synagogue in the first century in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, was a literary invention. And now we have at least 10, depending on how you count. We've seen some of them already in this series. Remember Capernaum, Capharnaum, the foundation of the first century synagogue? Masada has a synagogue. The Herodium has a synagogue where Herod the Great was buried. On and on and on. Migdal has two. Gamla up in the north in the Golan Heights is one of the most famous. And there are others as well. In my experience in taking people to Israel now for many decades, students and hundreds of people that I've taken, to get to something from the first century, if you're interested in Jesus, you could be a skeptic, believer, or somewhere in between, or just interested in history. But to touch the first century and to be in a building that existed in the first century and to be in a town or a city associated with Jesus and his movement, it's pretty extraordinary. And if you're a bit sentimental like I am about the ancient past, whether it's Jesus or George Washington or a battlefield or anything else, you always want to pause and look and think, and something in us kind of wells up because we're touching the past. And that's what I feel when I go to Magdala. So I hope you benefited and enjoyed this particular video, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.